Welcome to Whatsoever More or Less, a channel where citizens diligently study the U.S. Constitution for ourselves, seeking to understand it in the tradition of the founders. Occasionally, references will come from leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as our doctrine contains a divine mandate to defend the U.S. Constitution. Today we're going to get into Article 1, Sections 2 and 3, and I've got a sample picture of election results from last year's elections. Why do the results for elections look like this? Why is it that there's so many in the House of Representatives and so much less in the Senate, what have you? Okay, so here's part of why. Our founders believed a compound Republican structure to be the fairest and most likely to endure the typical challenges of other forms of government, and we'll be studying what the compound Republican structure is as we go through this. Thomas Jefferson said, "A democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49." So a lot of times people will say we have a democracy, which is true. We just have a modified democracy that's called a compound Republican form of government. It's a very, very secure system compared to just a democracy. John Adams, remember, democracy never lasts. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. Interesting wording. Benjamin Franklin, this is a great one. Democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Now, liberty, he says, liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote, right? So democracy is what it is. Liberty is a little bit more careful. There's some protections there, okay? And we're going to see what those are. And then Alexander Hamilton, we are a Republican government. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy. By the way, coming back to the Benjamin Franklin, I really probably should emphasize my 7 Ps again sometime soon and see where we are so far in going through Article 1, because I haven't been hitting that enough. But anyhow, it's, again, people's consent, which we'll be getting into that a bit, positions of power, powers enumerated, prohibitions, promises guaranteed, procedures to validate. I think I said them all. Anyhow, we'll be getting into that some more again soon. All right, so we have a bicameral Congress. This is part of the modification of democracy, right? A House of Representatives and a Senate. The terms qualifications, quantity are unique to each house. So the amounts, the terms, the qualifications are unique. They tried to structure it very carefully. So the terms, it's 2 years for the members of the House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 1 says the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. Okay, so 2 years for members of the House of Representatives. Elections coming up every 2 years for all of them. Okay, 6 years for members of the Senate. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 1 specifies, and I'm going to leave out the crossed out part because that's modified by amendments at this point. Whether we consider them super inspired or not, we can get into that in another video. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. So basically 6 years for members of the Senate and 2 years for the House of Representatives. So 3 times as much time for members of the Senate. And then there are 3 classes of senators. So that basically when they first set it up, they set it up to where 2 years after the Constitution went into effect, some of the senators came up for election. Then 4 years after, some more of the senators went up for election again. And then 6 years after, the rest of them went up for election again. So basically it's a constant cycle of 6 years, but offset every 2 years with 3 groups. So okay, qualifications. The House of Representatives, you have to be at least 25 years old, and you have to have at least 7 years of U.S. citizenship and be an inhabitant of the state you represent. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 2, no person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25 years and been 7 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state in which he shall be chosen. Okay, so that's for the House of Representatives, 25 years old, 7 years of U.S. citizenship, inhabitants of the state, versus the Senate. 5 years older at least, and so they have to be at least 30 years old, right? And then at least 9 years of U.S. citizenship, which is 2 more years than the requirement for the House of Representatives. And then they also have to be an inhabitant of the state they represent. Here's the text. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 3. No person shall be a senator who shall not have attained to the age of 30 years, been 9 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of the state for which he be chosen. Okay, so the Senate seems to be taken much more seriously on the requirements, and then they have a much longer term. And let's look at some of Madison's thoughts regarding that. This is from the Constitutional Convention, which Madison will tell you the most important way to understand the Constitution is the way it was understood by those who ratified it, not by the way it was understood by those who framed it. Still the same. I have this book and recommend getting this book. The notes from the Constitutional Convention. Here's what he says. In all new conventions, it would be in the interest of the people to leave as little as possible to the second will, which is the Senate. And he used the word desideratum, which I replaced with objective, but he did use the word desideratum. The great objective is to make government responsible. So far as the interest of the people can be made to do this, we ought to avail ourselves of the expedient, right? So I think he's referring to the House of Representatives. So far as the interest of the people can be made to do this, we have to avail ourselves of the expedient. The plan of Mr. Pinckney, a proposed plan of government, had many good ideas. One of them was that the second branch, the Senate, was to be elected for a long time. This would be a great check on the first branch, the House of Representatives. The more the powers of the two branches are the same, the more liable they will be to combine. It would be an improvement to divide the trust between the body's men who might watch and check each other. In this, they would be governed by the same prudence which has prevailed in organizing the subordinate departments of the government, where all businesses liable to abuses is made to pass through separate hands, the one being a check on the other. So they literally tried to make the two houses of Congress be pretty distinct from each other so that they wouldn't have a tendency to combine and act overly similar to each other, is really what I see he's getting at here. And pretty clever. We've got that significantly smaller number in the Senate, but it's a strict number, 2 per state, versus the House of Representatives is based on population, and a much larger House, less strict requirements, shorter terms, and yeah, pretty clever. Okay, so here's the quantity. Sorry, I kind of jumped the gun on that. House of Representatives, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. I'm only going to read the large letters in black because the rest, again, hasn't been affected by amendments. Later on, we'll get into whether I think it's all inspired or what have you. I think a lot of it really is, but that's besides the point. We're just going to read what is obviously relevant right now. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers. Sorry, this is where I jumped the gun earlier, but it's according to numbers. The number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least 1 representative. Okay, so there's the number. You shouldn't have more than. You shouldn't have a single representative representing less than 30,000 people. They didn't want way too many members. We'll get into that here in a second. And but each state should have at least 1 representative. So, and then the modern legislation has capped the number at 435. So then that's just kind of that 435 is broken up amongst the different states based on their population. Suddenly, if like Texas grew a bunch and California shrunk, suddenly Texas would have more representatives and California might have less, maybe, right? So, okay, then the Senate, Article 1, Section 3, Clause 1, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. I took out the red again, so we'll get into that being one of the things that may or may not have been inspired about how they changed the Constitution, but again, it's not based on population. Each state just gets 2 senators, period. Whether it's Texas or California or whether it's Rhode Island and Hawaii, they all get 2 senators. All right. This is, I asked AI for some thoughts. I find James Madison and Thomas Jefferson to be some of the most useful people to refer to. I believe that's the real tradition of the founders. I asked what they thought, or what Madison thought about the quantity of the House of Representatives. He said it should be small enough to prevent mob rule. and ensure accountability so you can't keep track of them if it's too large, right? It should be able to balance functionality and representation with free consultation and discussion. But it ought to be kept within a certain limit in order to avoid confusion and temperance of a multitude, right? That's pretty clever. So you don't want it to be too huge. Preventing faction and mob rule. He says, had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would have been a mob, right? If you've got, one representative for every 100 people, that's going to start turning into chaos. I don't see how you'd manage that. Ensuring quality representation. So by having less representatives, in other words, I think it's like 300,000 people are represented by each representative or somewhere around there. I couldn't tell you exactly, but whoever gets elected, they have to make it through all 300,000 of those people in their vote. So it ensures higher quality. He did worry about each representative representing too many people, though, because they'd be too little acquainted with local issues, which, by the way, honestly, we have enumerated powers which have been far exceeded. We're going to get into that in a future presentation, but this is why the enumerated powers are so important. The 10th Amendment, we'll get into that later too, is so important because they were never meant to handle all these things, and we shouldn't have to be worrying about whether or not that one representative who represents 300,000 people is overly familiar with every last need we have, because a lot of things should be left to local government. Okay, so we'll get into that more in future presentations. And then he did expect growth. So anyhow, there's the notes. I just copied them or screenshot them from Google AI, so pretty useful. All right, this quote is interesting considering how amendments have changed these two sections of Article 1. Defending our divinely inspired Constitution, President Oakes. Our belief that the United States Constitution was divinely inspired does not mean that the divine revelation dictated every word or phrase, such as provisions allocating the number of representatives, like we just studied, from each state or the minimum age of each. The Constitution was not a fully grown document, said President J. Reuben Clark. On the contrary, he explained, we believe it must grow and develop to meet the changing needs of an advancing world. For example, inspired amendments abolished slavery and gave women the right to vote. And this is part of why there was so much blanked out stuff just now when I read, and there will be more still in the future. However, we do not see inspiration in every Supreme Court decision in interpreting the Constitution regarding the difference between how much respect he shows for amendments in this quote and how much he kind of pokes at the Supreme Court rulings. If you go back and watch my video about all legislative powers in the Supreme Law, you'll get more perspective on this quote and others. Okay, now we've seen that a lot has been amended in the first portions, and part of why I carefully inspect each clause and the changes to them is because of this Ezra Taft Benson quote. Ezra Taft Benson, he wasn't a lawyer. As a matter of fact, it seems like the majority of the experience he got learning about government was while he was already an apostle. So he went to Europe for the aftermath of World War II while he was an apostle. He served for 8 years as a Secretary of Agriculture for Dwight D. Eisenhower while he was an apostle. He was sent to research the records in the vault of the St. George Temple regarding the visiting of the Founding Fathers to President Wilford Woodruff at the time that he was the St. George Temple president. And he did this under the assignment of Spencer W. Kimball while he was an apostle. To me, it sounds like Nephi getting the tour directly from the Lord of see this, this is what's going on. And when you get the Lord giving the tour, it's the best tour you can possibly get. So I think President Benson is probably the best person to comment on government anyhow. So again, he says, for the past 2 centuries, those who do not prize freedom have chipped away at every major clause of our Constitution. Until today, we face a crisis of great dimensions. Okay, so you may hear me challenge the content of some changes to the Constitution from time to time, or sometimes you may hear me say, I like the content, but the precedent that was set and the way it was brought about was a bad precedent. You're playing with fire, kind of thing, and we'll get into that in future videos. But I believe President Benson wanted us to just know the Constitution and start learning to recognize these things. So, okay, so please like and subscribe. I'm committed to continue to be very diligent in trying to share the best content on the topic of the Constitution and the proper role of government.